Hello, everyone. Today is December 23rd, 2022. My guest today is Samira Sawlani. Samira is a journalist and writer. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Samira.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. It's been a long time coming, a long time planning.
Yes, it has been a long time planning, but I'm excited you're here as well. So, what you what is your where did you grow up?
Okay. So I was born in India, and then when I was a baby, I moved to Dubai. And then when I was 5, I moved to London. And so I've grown up in London. London is my home. Um, and yeah, so I mean, as much as I'm a diaspora baby and been around a bit. London is where I grew up. London is where my family are. London is my home.
What do you mean by diaspora, baby?
So, in the sense that though my parents are from India, they have moved to the UK, and that's makes me part of the diaspora, the Indian diaspora. And so I guess, and since we moved here when I was quite young, I've always described myself as a diaspora baby who, you come from a different country and culture, and you live in another country and within another culture.
Okay. And how do you think your family's time in Dubai affect that culture, within your family?
So most of my extended family live in Dubai. And I have really fond memories of growing up there, because everyone was around, there was so much family. At the time, Dubai was not what it is now. It was very much very small. You didn't have the big malls and all the rest of it, but it was fun. So now if you want to do something on a Friday night in Dubai, you have a million and one options. At that time, the Friday night was going and getting ice cream at Baskins and Robbins, which was one of the few ice cream parlors they had. My time there, I was there from when I was about 6 months old to when I was 5. So it wasn't very long, but it did form a lot of my childhood, in the sense when we then moved to London. I remember finding this place incredibly lonely, because in Dubai it was lights and family and people, and you come here and it wasn't. Um, so I still feel like I have a real fondness and attachment to Dubai. Every time I go past one of these perfume stores in London where they sell the oud perfumes, which is what a lot of the Dubai malls will smell of, I always get that slight feeling of almost homesickness. It's a really nice, magical place.
That's great that you got to experience that.
Mm.
And so you said you felt a little lonely moving to London. What what do you think is different about London compared to you mentioned it, there were less lights.
Yeah,
But
less lights, and I think family. My I come from a large family, and so I think in Dubai it would be aunties and uncles and cousins. You were surrounded by them, and then we moved here, and that wasn't the case. And London is a wonderful city, and I've written a piece about cities as human beings, and I always say London is like, it's like a moody boyfriend. You you can't quite leave him. You should, because he's so moody and inconsistent, but you just can't. And it's such a special place. But when you move here, as I did as a child, and we moved in January, so smack bang in the winter. And even now, if I look out the window, I'm home in London right now. It's 4:15, and it's so dark. So all of that, you don't have your family around. You start a new school. Um, it's a brand new city and it gets dark and it's cold and it's rainy and you're 5 years old. You're just trying to understand, well, six. I just turned 6. You're just trying to understand, like, where have I ended up? That's how it used to feel.
I can imagine it's very strange going that huge climate change and also huge culture change.
Absolutely. And, you know, now in the last few years, I do spend time kind of reading books and listening to podcasts about health and well-being. And we hear so much about how light and sunshine play such a huge part in mood. And I think when you're a kid and you come here and you're lonely and you don't know anyone, and then there's not much sunshine and all these things on a subtle level, it all adds up to you not always feeling your best. It was a real shock in terms of both climate and culture. And even now, all these years on living here, I can't handle the cold, can't stand the dark. And when I wake up in the morning and it's dark, I'm just like, come on, even though it's been, you know, so many years.
I can understand cold is not very fun and dark is not very fun. And you mentioned London is kind of like a boyfriend that you know you should leave. At what age did you start realizing that maybe your path wasn't going to keep you in London?
I think it was when I was about probably around 19, 20, where I would be like, well, what do I want to do with my life? You know, you're picking your courses for university, and I just knew that long term, this was not a city that I wanted to live in. And I don't know why, but it was always, you know, at that age, I was like, I want to work for the UN, so I want to go off to Geneva or New York or whatever. And not that these cities are any better in London than London in terms of climate and darkness, but I just, for some reason, never quite felt like this was the city that I saw my future in. And ironically, now that I have kind of moved to Nairobi, this is my first trip back to London since I kind of moved in September, and I can handle all of it. The rain, the clouds. I'm like, oh, but it's London. I love it. And it's an odd, you know, I think there's a quote, I think it may be Rumi, who said, you know, and I paraphrase this really badly, but sometimes like you need to go away from home to come back and find it. And I think that that's definitely where I'm at right now, where I've come back to London and I feel, and this is just a brief trip, but feeling like, wow, in the end, this really is the only home I have. You know, this is all I've got, and it's not bad. It's not a bad place.
No, and that's a nice feeling to get, when you come back, when you were younger, you didn't feel necessarily like it was your home, but to come back and have those feelings, that's very warm instead of having the same, oh, I'm feeling lonely here. I can't, this isn't necessarily too comfortable.
Gosh, you've described it in such a poignant way. I also feel really emotional. It is nice. It is finally nice to maybe find some belonging in the world. I don't know. Maybe that is, I think when I got back, I just had a moment where I just thought to me, I came out of the airport at Heathrow and it was freezing. And I'd made the mistake when I'd gone to Kenya. I hadn't really taken warm clothes with me. So I don't even know, I was wearing a hoodie and then a hoodie on top of that. Like I'd done whatever I could. And I came out and it was so cold. I think it was somewhere around 1 or 2 degrees. And I felt really cold wind on my face and I felt happy. And I was like, I could stand out here in the cold and be okay, because really and truly, I think in that moment, I was like, this is it. This is the only home you've got. This is the closest thing you'll find to home. And every day since then, you know, when I've been caught up in the snow, because it snowed a couple of weeks back. It snowed a couple of days after I arrived back. It's just felt like, doesn't matter. This is the home you have. And it's been a long time coming, I think, looking for somewhere that I felt like, yeah, okay, I belong. And I can't, you know, dismiss the fact that over the last, I don't know how many years, we see UK government policies really alienate foreigners. Or, you know, you can have your British passport, but that can be, your Britishness is very revocable. And so I've always felt a slight discomfort in terms of, can I really say this is my home, considering, you know, some of the media, some of the structures, some of the policies in place, in terms of how people of color in this country are treated. And so that's still, you know, it is what it is, but this is what I've got in terms of a home. I'm very much like, this is it. And I go back to Nairobi next month, and that's a different kind of home. But right now, this is the place I get that feeling of home, which I have never had.
That's great.
London before, yeah.
What do you mean you feel your Britishness could be revoked?
I think the recent World Cup really is a prime example. You know, when the black players of color in the English football team miss penalties or make an error, all of a sudden the abuse they get is unreal. When they do well, though, then they're English. And I think that that's what, you know, we've seen, at least from my experience, what I think we've seen time and time again, that when, you know, when things are good, okay, fine, you're English, you're British. When they're not, though, that, for me, there's a question mark there. I think I'm lucky that London is as multicultural as it is. Some parts of this country are not, but I think when you've experienced racism here, when you've seen it, when you see sometimes the way the media conducts itself, I at least am very aware that, yes, I live here, yes, I have a British passport, yes, this is where I've grown up, but ultimately I'm Asian. And you know, it doesn't take a, you know, we always make this joke where it's you know, if an English footballer does well, say one who's no, hang on, you know, I think it was a French player, actually. I think it was Benzema who said, I hope I pronounced that right, who said that, oh, you know, when I score, I'm French, but when I make a mistake, I'm Algerian. I think it feels sometimes like a similar thing where you're like, well, okay, I'm British today, but I don't know with you guys. And people find it now and they're like, but your prime minister's Indian. And I'm like, yeah, but my prime minister's a conservative with tons of money. So, you know, and you can't, someone tweeted me that day saying you can't achieve your way out of racism. And I think you can do 1,000 things to prove your Britishness, but where racism is, racism is. And so I'm just always aware of that. And I know that I have other Black Asian friends who don't necessarily feel that way. But for me, when I'm here, I am always like, just remember you're Asian, and that how accepted you are in this society can sometimes be a question mark.
That's I think a lot of people have felt that. The interesting thing, I don't know when you were younger, if you put a definition to that kind of, let's call it white privilege in Western countries, Britain, the USA. I felt that throughout my entire childhood, where it's like, okay, I'm of Iranian descent, I'm in the United States. There are certain things that I just could not do. I don't think I would receive the same reaction than as someone of Anglo-American descent, Anglo descent for you in Britain. And it's important that we speak about this, because I'm not sure if it was spoken about much, you know, before, when you were 19 going into your classes. I'm sure you had those sentiments, because I remember having them when I was younger. But now within the last 5-6 years that's really become very people have become outspoken about that. And
Yeah.
you've had, even in the US, something like Black Lives Matter movement, which has been huge for, I think, all people of color, just bringing this sort of dialogue, you know, to the to everyone, bringing it public.
Absolutely. I think social media has played a huge part in that, because all of a sudden there was all these independent online platforms where people were writing articles and saying, well, I'm a person of color, or I'm Black, or I'm of Asian descent, and this is my experience with racism, and this is my experience of what it is to live in a Western country. And I think that all of a sudden you were hearing from all these voices that traditional media wasn't bringing you. And we went from, oh, racism is when someone racially abuses you in the street or says something to you. We went from that to, there's a whole load of other kinds of racism. There's a whole load of microaggressions. There's racism in terms of when you're being recruited for a job. There's racial microaggressions in terms of, oh, I can't pronounce your name. Can I just call you, by a nickname? And I think it gave words. All of a sudden, we all had, those of us who never before had it, had the language and the spaces to bring these experiences into. And I think that goes from, those online platforms to the likes of Twitter, where people were going on saying, well, this was my experience and this is what it's like. And it was long overdue. How much has changed? I don't know. I can't say. But I do think that there is a power in having these spaces now where we can tell our truth.
Yes, there is a power, and it's the narrative. You're getting so many more narratives than just one or two mainstream media narratives. And so you said at age of 19 you were choosing your coursework, you weren't sure what you wanted to do. But you knew that possibly London wasn't going to be, you weren't going to keep your entire path in London. What did you end up doing or what did you study in academia, and how did that affect your thinking?
So I really enjoyed sociology and psychology in high school. And I applied to a couple of universities to study psychology and a couple of universities to study sociology and politics. Psychology didn't work out because they needed, one of the requirements was to be quite good at statistics. And I just about passed maths at GCSE level. So there was no way I was going to be able to even carry on any further. So I went with sociology and politics, and a lot of what I studied at my undergrad was British politics, a little bit of American politics, and more political systems rather than, contemporary, what was going on at the time. And I think what I learned then was, okay, so this is what I'm learning about the systems, but what I'm more keen on is to know how these systems come to be, how they affect our day-to-day lives, and how they can be changed. And the little that would go into looking at international stuff made me think, okay, so I definitely am more interested in international affairs. And so at the time when it came to doing my undergraduate dissertation, I chose to do mine on Saudi Arabia, democracy and human rights, because what I could see a lot of was you were getting a lot of discourse, and then we'd seen it growing up as well, in our local media here in the UK, of these countries, quote unquote, in the Middle East, they're incompatible with human rights, they're incompatible with democracy. And I thought, and the portrayal of the Middle East in general was always everyone's so backwards. And I used to read all this and think, wow, gosh, I have spent my early years in the Middle East, and nowhere is perfect, and I always found it questionable when I would see Western countries very much act like they were the kind of, they set the standard for human rights and all the rest of it. And so as I did my undergrad dissertation, I ironically became more interested in the politics of the Middle East. So Africa was not in my periphery at all. And I thought to myself, I want to study this further, the history and the politics of Middle Eastern countries, and MENA, Middle East and North Africa. And so that was really where my focus had gone.
Okay. And you did a dissertation on democracy and human rights in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and I wish I could remember so much of what I'd written, but it was looking at the legal system there, the ideas of democracy and human rights, in terms of the Western schools of thought around it, and looking at, well, they claim, they being a lot of schools of thought in the West, that there is no compatibility between the two, that countries like Saudi can't have human rights and democracy, that the way the systems are set up there, the systems that law is rooted in, means it can't work. And I just looked into that, can't fully remember what my final findings were, but that was something that had interested me so much, in terms of, again, who sets the narrative of what's going on in these countries and whether they are compatible, quote unquote, with these concepts.
Okay. The narratives are very important, and they can be, people have a view pattern, and that comes out in their writing.
Yeah.
And so you did your undergraduate studies in sociology and politics.
Mhm.
After when did you know that you wanted to become a journalist and or a writer?
Well, you probably wouldn't believe it, but I think the journalism thing came. So after I finished my undergrad, I had a year where I was working, and then I went off to do my master's. And when I was finishing up my master's, I got a call from a former colleague who said that by this time I had, through my master's, been studying a lot about African countries, a couple of African countries' history. And this colleague of mine said, oh, I know of someone who they're looking for someone in Uganda to come work at their NGO for 3 months. Would you be interested? And I was like, yeah, sure. It was an internship.
What's an NGO?
A non-governmental organization.
Okay.
So I said, okay, you know what? It's 3 months. It's Uganda. I can do it. So off I went. And then when I finished that, I got a contract to go and work at a refugee camp in Uganda, near the border with DR Congo. And at that point, I was like, I actually think I want to work in humanitarian aid. And I came back and I just could not find a job in that field. It just was not happening. Whatever I was applying for, I wasn't even getting interviews, whether it was a lack of experience, whether it's, these spaces are quite, as much as there is some transparency, a lot of it is also getting in through who you know. And I didn't know people. So even the opportunity I'd got to go out and work there was through Red Cross Uganda. And I did that as, I think I was just lucky. I think I got lucky with that. And so I came back to the UK, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. You know, I'm applying for all these jobs, I'm not getting them. I just don't know what I'm doing. And at the time, Uganda was having its elections, and I had got a little admin job at a local estate agent while I was trying to figure out what to do next. And I emailed, there was a Ugandan newspaper I read frequently called The Observer. And I emailed the editor and I said, you know, I'd love to just write a piece on how Ugandans in the UK feel about the upcoming elections. And he said, well, we can't pay you, but we'll give you a platform. And I thought, well, let me just try this. And I wrote that piece, and it sounds like a fairy tale, but it's really not. I haven't looked back since. It just took on a life of its own. Yes, there was a lot of working for free, and I totally understand that I had the privilege that I was living with my parents. I did have that job at the estate agent for a while, that I was able to do it. And I think I always say, you know, being able to take on unpaid work is a privilege. It's a privilege I had, for which I'm grateful, but it is a privilege, which is why I'm so passionate about places paying people who work for them. I don't agree with unpaid internships. I don't think it's fair to expect anyone to do stuff for free or for exposure, because that stuff does not pay the bills. Yeah, and then it's just got bigger and bigger. You know, you start off like that, you get the confidence to pitch to other places, you write a little bit more, you find more things you're interested in, and then this, I promise this isn't meant to sound as arrogant as it does, but 2022, you make the front page of the New York Times, you know, and it's been a hell of a journey.
That's amazing. What article made the front of the New York Times?
So it was an opinion piece, and it was about the Kenyan elections and how young people were, you were seeing a lot of young people say they weren't going to vote, and young Kenyans saying they weren't going to vote. And people were framing it as apathy, as indifference, when the reality is that actually not voting for them was a political choice. It was them sending a message saying, none of you candidates represent who we are, and we aren't going to just turn up at the ballot and vote for who we think is the lesser evil. And so that was the piece, that, you know, they're saying, no, not interested, not coming out to vote. And it's not because we're indifferent or apathetic. This is a choice. This feels empowering to say, I'm not participating in this election. So that was the piece that was out in August.
That's very exciting for you.
Yeah, it was a big dream to make the New York Times. And then on New Year's Eve every year, I always write a list of the things that I want to manifest for the following year. And I think the New York Times had been on there 2-3 years. So to finally have got there this year was, yeah, I think I'm still have moments where I'm like, wow, did that actually happen? But and I think what felt more important was not that, oh, I got published in the New York Times. It's that piece made it, because I do think that it's unfair to just describe a whole group of young people as being apathetic or uninterested in the political process, as if they don't care. I did think that was unfair. I think if you choose to go and vote in an election, it's fine. It makes sense to me. And I understand that the amount people have fought in order to have the vote in so many countries around the world is huge. And it's easy to say, but your ancestors fought for this. And I understand that. But at the same time, if these young people are choosing not to vote, we need to listen to them. There's reasons why. And for me, that was what made the whole New York Times thing more exciting, because I got to say, well, you have to stop grouping them as just these uninterested young people who don't feel like they are bothered enough to participate in democracy. And also, you know, democracy doesn't begin and end at the ballot box. Like, there are other ways, and the young people in Kenya do all sorts of things, you know, mutual aid systems they're involved in. You have people holding protests about things. Like, they have participated or they lead things in their own ways. And there are so many exciting projects that are examples of that. And just because they didn't turn up to vote, I thought it's not okay just to say, oh, they don't care.
No, it's not. It's a choice. It's as much of a choice as voting for a particular candidate.
Mm-hmm.
In the country of Brazil, every person, it's law, you have to vote no matter
Wow.
what. Yes. And it changes the aspects of the election.
I mean, gosh, I don't, I don't, I wonder if I was given a choice of candidates that I wasn't keen on, but I had to go and vote. I mean, I guess then you do just vote for your lesser evil. That's, I guess, you pick the
Yes.
candidate you dislike the least. And then is that then, can they really sleep at night knowing that they've been elected because people love them? Because to me, if everyone is forced to vote, then how much of the votes I've got is because they actually wanted to elect me, and how much is it just because they had to vote for someone? I don't know.
Yes, that's a good question. And I think for politicians who get elected successfully, they're not
Yeah, it
questioning
doesn't,
it
does
too
it?
much.
Mm-mm. No.
But that, you know, that's really what you mentioned about young Kenyans not choosing not to vote, and not just they're especially people from the West, with African people, with people from third world countries. You can take on there's we don't see so much the logic in their actions, and I think it's because we don't understand the situation.
Yeah.
And also there needs, we have a very distorted view. People from the United Kingdom, people from the USA, it's a very privileged life, and there are a lot of subtleties within our lives that don't exist for for the general African. Maybe you can put many other countries in there. And so it's important for people like you to bring the voices of just the normal African person to the West in a perspective that is not from necessarily a mainstream news source or coming from the top down. And so, did you want to speak?
No, go ahead.
So, you mentioned you in your master's study, you learned about Africa. How long did you spend in Uganda?
I was there for about a year.
Okay.
Hang on. No, how I can't even. Yeah, no, less than a year, just less than a year. It was less than a year. God, it's been so long. It was less than a year, but it was long enough for me to, I think what has always made a difference in terms of my approach to things is because I was born in India and I'm Indian, British Indian, if we're going to put labels on it, because that's why coming from a different background meant I saw quite early on that every country, every culture, we've all got our own systems. And all too often, Western systems are the norm, right? And we are all othered. And so I think even when it comes to the journalism, for example, um, it's less about kind of bringing the African voices to the West and more about being like, you know what, the way it's Africans and the way they're written about, the way entire continents, entire countries, both from there and other, especially the global South, is so problematic in that often it can be so dehumanizing, when the truth is people in Kenya are just living their normal lives, and then you get a lot of these kind of Western publications. And I remember, I think it was in 2019, maybe, the New York Times put out an advert looking for a Africa correspondent. And the advert itself was very, very cliched, if telling stories from the Congolese river and the forests of this and that, and they were heavily criticized for it, because the truth is those are normal places. We live in normal places, and we're all just trying to make it through life, through the nuances of our very different challenges. Some of our challenges are the same, some of our challenges are different. But this constant kind of treating Africa as a monolithic entity, and then, so the UK's infamous newspaper, the Daily Mail, would put up articles about like tribes in South Sudan, for example, who wear certain kinds of jewelry. And they'd be like, oh, the South Sudanese tribe who do this, who do that. And you think, well, if those guys were going to sit there and write about us over here, they'll probably be like, oh, those British people who walk around with greasy hair for weeks on end. I don't know. But I think that for me, it's always just been, I see my work as being the kind where you tell people stories in an authentic way, and to the best of your ability, you don't write it for any particular gaze. I just want to tell people stories. That really is the beginning and the end for me in terms of my work. I just want to be like, this person experienced this or whatever, and I don't want it to ever require any kind of, or I reject at least any kind of coverage which makes them be like, oh, that those poor Africans far away. For me, that's not okay. Dignity. I think when you write about people, when you write about countries, when you write about spaces, give them the same dignity. And that's why a lot of the coverage here, you stop and think, if this tragedy would have happened in the UK, would you write about it the way you're writing about, and that it's a debate that comes up a lot with publishing pictures of dead bodies. So when the Dusit Hotel terror attack happened in Kenya, the New York Times did publish quite a graphic photo. And question that was rightly asked was, would you have published photos of people, graphic photos, had this attack occurred in the US? So for me, it's always those kind of things that go through my mind when I'm working on a piece or when I'm on Twitter. That give people dignity through your work. That's the least they deserve.
Dignity is very important. And you've been exposed to these environments, and I think that exposure gives you more insight than a lot of people. Maybe, I'm not sure. What do you think? Do you think people who are exposed and go to Africa and are immersed in this, that they're still able to write with that sort of posh superiority?
Oh, you'd be surprised. Gosh, you'd be, oh, yeah. I think so. I think you will still get those that go there and will still write in ways that for me are not necessarily okay. And I don't know what makes us all the way we are, right? I don't know why I write in the way that I write and others write in the way that they write. The closest thing I've been able to find to an answer when I'm really asked about it is, I'm like, maybe it is being Asian growing up in the UK, and you see the way your own community was covered by mainstream media, or your own country, the country you come from at least. Maybe that's what does it. I don't know. I just know that I have a real pet peeve when I see coverage of places where it's very almost insulting to the population. Yeah, the stereotypes. I try and stay away from stereotypes, you know, and I think that ultimately that is where a lot of people can go wrong when they do indulge in those same stereotypes and reinforcing those same stereotypes about countries and people.
Yes, and they're almost certainly wrong to apply a single rule to,
Mm,
even even five people. It's probably not true, but then to do it to an entire, citizenry of a country, there's so much nuance and so many people that are being mislabeled and judged on, fallacy, on fiction.
absolutely.
And so also going back to your first, proposition to that Uganda newspaper, that takes courage to send out, say, hey, can I write this article for you? A lot of people, that's not so easy.
No, and you know what's ironic? I'd find it harder to do now. At that time, you've got nothing to lose, right? And so a friend of mine always says, it's the worst thing they can say is no. And I'm very much like, the worst thing they can say is no. Unfortunately, now if I get a no, it hits harder. So having the courage to send out emails like that is a little bit trickier now, but I do, and if anyone listening right now is thinking about sending that email or sending that text in any context, just do it, because, and there's the Trevor Noah quote, and again, I'm going to paraphrase him really badly, but he says something like, um, it's not, rejection isn't the worst thing, regret is. And I think I look back now and I think if I hadn't sent that email and I hadn't, gone on the path I am now, would I be sat here regretting it, thinking, I wish I'd sent it?
And now
You
you
know,
don't have to worry about that.
no, now I'm like, I did the right thing. And yeah, and then so I just think, look, when you get a no, it can be really difficult, it can be really painful, it can be really disheartening, and I understand that. But if you want to win the lottery, you need to go buy the lottery ticket. You can't win without playing the game, just sitting on the sidelines. And so I think generally that's often been my approach to a few things, where I'm like, just say it, just ask, just send the email, just send the text, just make the call. If they say no, yeah, you'll sulk, yeah, you'll struggle. Mental health may take a bit of a hit, but at least you know.
Yes, at
Um,
least you know.
at least you know, and then you can move on, right? Then you can move on.
And that's one of the most important things, to not obsess, to not sulk, to not just think about these same if I should, if I should, if I should. If we can calculate, that the rejection really isn't going to be that bad. It's not like we're trying to jump from one ledge to the other, where
Mhm.
if we fail, we fall off a ledge. It's just an email, it's just a text, it's just a reaching out. And a lot of times, the people that we're reaching out to, that it's understandable. Maybe they won't respond, but it's not like, you are it's not like it's a crazy proposition for you
Yeah,
to go and write an article for them. They understand. Even if they didn't respond to you, they would say, oh, this person wants to write for us. I get it.
yeah, and norm. I think a lot of the times it's what we attach to things. So even now, when I pitch pieces, um, someone once said to me, so I was struggling with sending a pitch, and she said to me, forget the outcome, forget the editor you're sending it to, forget who may read it, forget if it will get written, if it will get published. Engage with the text of the pitch. It's you and the words. And it's something that I do so frequently now. So even if I have to tell someone how I feel about something, I'm like, forget about what they might say, forget about how you might feel, engage with the words of how you're going to get out what you're feeling. And the same thing, you know, you want to pitch to someone, forget about them, forget about you, write the pitch. What do you want to write about? Why do you want to write about this? Why is it relevant? Send it. Don't worry about them. Don't worry about yourself. It's you and your words. That's all you need to engage with. Put the feelings and emotions aside.
Okay. And I guess that's a good segue to a question. What is your writing process like? How do you maybe begin or think about, or, how do you just get an article or a piece of writing out to the public?
Okay, so the first thing that I'm always very honest about is I struggle a fair amount with anxiety. You know, I can have days where it's bad, and that is not always useful for a writer. In fact, it's probably the least useful emotion. Um, so that is one of my battles that I come up against when I need to write a piece. And I have to manage that. So some of the things that I tend to do, so, you know, I have 2 weekly columns now. One I just started 2 weeks ago for a Kenya-based online platform called Debunk Media. And then I've had my other column, my first baby, as I call it, for The Continent, which is my column is very satirical. It's a bit jokey. It's a bit fun. And, you know, we do a weekly roundup of things that have happened on the African continent. And I throw in a bit of sarcasm. And so it's interesting to me that whether it's that particular column, which I've been doing for God almost a year and a half now, or a fresh new piece of work, the anxiety and the discomfort I feel is the same. I don't get used to it. You know, when I have to wake up on Thursday morning and write my column, I still feel that discomfort. So I very much am like, okay, I'm feeling anxious. Just be aware of the anxiety. I tend to, and I know it sounds so woozy and new age, but I do tend to try and meditate before I sit down to write a piece, just to clear my head. Or there's like a YouTube video called Yoga for Writers. I'll do that because it helps ground me. And because of my anxiety, I do need to be quite grounded. And then and I also will never type straight away. I need pen to paper and I make notes. What am I trying to say in this article? What does this need to be about? So my first set of notes will always be pen to paper. There's something for me about pen and paper that just sits better in my brain. And then after that, I will get onto the laptop. It's weird because there isn't necessarily a writing process, but there's a process around the writing, which is the kind of yoga, the meditation, the reminding yourself again and again, this is about the words, this is about the story you're trying to tell. And anytime you go off course, coming back and asking yourself, why is the story important? What am I trying to say? Why did I choose to write it?
Okay.
And giving yourself as much time as possible, because I can procrastinate like the best of them. Oh, I will find, you know, if I have an article to write and you call me and you say to me, I need, I don't know, biscuits from the supermarket, I will find the furthest supermarket, go and get you the best biscuits, because anything to get away from the work.
That's understandable. Writing is so intensive, mentally intensive.
It's a lot.
It is a lot. And especially when you're continually going back into purpose. Why am I writing this? What am I trying to say? What words am I using? Because there are a lot of times when, I've written a few articles and you can just go on and on and on. And then, 2 or 3 sentences in, that's really you. It's relevant, but it's not what you're trying to say. It's kind of getting away from the main purpose.
Yeah. Oh, going off on tangents, getting distracted with your own writing. I think one of the helpful things is, while bearing in mind who your audience is, try to detach from the thoughts around what will they think when they read this piece when you're writing it, because that's one thing I think that trips up a lot of people. Will people read this piece, or what will they think if they read it? Because all of a sudden you're no longer in your process. You're constantly thinking of the future. When it's published, what's going to happen? And that's of no use. I find that very unhelpful when my mind starts to do that.
I can imagine. And so you mentioned that your first article was to a publisher, a newspaper publisher in Uganda. Was there any other reasons that you began to revolve your writing around Africa and African countries?
I think it was just because I had cropped up so much during my master's, and then of course my time in Uganda, that I just became more interested in the continent. I'd already spent so many years kind of reading books set there, reading histories, watching things, that it took up all my time and my energy, everything. I was just so interested in what was going on there. And I don't have an explanation for it. I still don't know. Maybe it was living there in Uganda for a while that did it. So I think that was it. And then soon after, I ended up in Kenya for one of their elections as an observer. And then I think it kind of carried on from there, because I spent a fair amount of time there during that election. And yeah, just my interest in the country grew. And I was writing about it. And yeah, it's hard to pinpoint why or how it ended up being Africa. It just did. And I became interested in other aspects of things as well. So things like how celebrities often use Africa, as for their quote unquote philanthropy, and the ethics of that from time to time. Yeah, it just happened. It happened to me.
Okay. And how do over this time, how is your relationship with Africa? And you specifically write about East Africa. In case people don't know, Uganda and Kenya, they border each other, correct?
They do. And now, I mean, my Twitter bio says analyst on East Africa because that is my focus. But if you look at my Twitter, I pretty much tweet about the whole continent. And my weekly column is a summary of events on the whole continent. So I've cast my net quite wide, but I think the areas I'm more confident on are probably, I would say, East Africa.
Okay. And
It's
one
because also, I
example.
guess I live there now.
Okay. And both Uganda and Kenya, just for people's awareness, are ex-colonies of the United
Yes.
Kingdom.
Yes.
And whereas Africa has ex-colonies from France, Portugal, even the Dutch, I believe Italy as well. So it's one thing. In going back to you speaking about covering the entire continent, there was one article you wrote recently on, it was published in The Elephant, and it was about coups and the coups that have been occurring within, it seemed mostly West Africa within the last 2 years. What have you seen, now that you've started writing outside? What do you notice about the African continent as a whole? And what's do you notice since COVID, the outbreak of COVID?
So I think if we're talking in terms of the politics, we have had coups in Guinea, in Burkina Faso and Mali, coup attempts in Guinea-Bissau, and there was one in Niger, if I remember, and just I think it was yesterday or the day before, the Gambia authorities there said that there was an alleged coup plot. And again, you see, this is where I think things get a bit wrong. So yes, there are coups, and yes, there are leaders who have been in power probably far longer than they should have been. And yes, there are countries where leaders are very authoritarian and freedoms are limited. But there are also countries with healthy democracies, with chilled out elections, with peaceful transfers of power. And I think that's what needs to be remembered. So last month in Equatorial Guinea, President Obiang Nguema won, quote unquote, an election and is now set. I think he's been in power, is it 43 years? 45 years, one of the two, 43, I think. So he's won a sixth term, and so off he goes for his 43rd year in power. But at the same time, in August, Kenya had an election, and President Kenyatta finished his 2 terms. William Ruto was declared winner, and was, pretty fairly. It was a calm, just election, and everyone got on with things. And when the opposition who lost took it to court to challenge the result, court went through its process, upheld William Ruto's win, and everything's going as it's going. And so I think that really is something that we see happen a fair amount with Africa, that people are like, oh, coups and dictators, and it's like, yeah, and countries where actually elections happen and everything's pretty normal and everyone gets on with life. And so I think it's been a mix. We've still got some of our aging rulers, leaders, whatever you want to call them. And then we've got vibrant democracies where things are changing.
And Africa, I believe it has over 50. Am I right to say it has over 50 countries?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it? Okay. That's a lot of governments. And what was that?
That's a lot of governments.
Yes. And one thing, is a lot of these governments are young.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not easy being a young country, and being an ex-colony. And there's a lot of nuance across the continent too. I think a lot of times we, like I said, we can lump Africa as a whole. Well, North Africa might as well be, it's a whole, you go across the Sahara, it's a different world. Then I think you have East Africa, which isn't too how do you relate East Africa and West Africa?
I think as much as I group them as East Africa, West Africa, I think I am constantly aware that, like you said, it's 54 countries and they all have their own systems, cultures, languages, the whole lot. And you see, we don't tend to refer to Europe as one big entity. So for me, it's also very much like, okay, so we've seen coups in these 3 countries, which are coincidentally in West Africa, but every country has its own history and its own systems. And I try and look at it very much in that way, because I don't see too much of, well, Western Europe is like this and Eastern Europe is like this. So I'm also like, well, then you've got Uganda and Kenya and Liberia and Sierra Leone and Ethiopia and Somalia and South Africa and Lesotho, and they all differ in their own ways.
Yes. And you can't apply one rule to the other rule because both of their populations have black skin or both of their populations are on the same continent. No, these are different people and different geographies with different histories and different cultures. And it's like calling people from Britain and people from Greece the same.
Yeah.
It's not
We
true.
seem to make that differentiation in Europe for Europe, but unfortunately, we don't tend to extend that same thing to Africa or to some other parts of the global south.
Yes, and it's crazy when, most people don't understand how large Africa is. Um, huge.
It's
And
huge, it's huge. Even if you just look at traveling across, it's huge.
and so to think that some people from 6,000 miles away have the same cultural values is, it's just nonsense.
Totally agreed.
And so one thing, you've written an article, The Dictator's Handbook, where you kind of list out what, what if a person wants to be a dictator, how they can go about it. And you've studied political systems and you've seen Africa, which has, as we've mentioned, 54 countries, lots of political systems, lots of changing political systems. What, after, your readings and your studies and your writings and experiences, what do you think makes a successful functioning democracy? What do you think a country needs?
Oh gosh, there's a question. You know, it's hard for me to answer that, but I think at the crux of it, it's freedom. I think a democracy can function well when people have freedoms to, freedom of speech, freedom to be who they are. And I also think a country which works for its citizens, systems work, service delivery works. Your taxes go into serving you. I think countries where there is accountability, where leaders are held accountable for their conduct, for the policies they pass, where there are consequences for leaders when they do terrible, awful things. And I can put the African continent aside for a moment, but when I look at the UK, the corruption scandals that happened during COVID-19, during those lockdowns, involving senior ruling party members, our then Minister of Health, all this. I mean, our own, at that time, Boris Johnson, he's had his fair share of scandals. We have a member of the royal family who really has been involved in some really problematic things and is still out there living his life on our taxes. And then I stop and I think, are we in a democracy? Because, yep, we can all go vote. Yep, our current prime minister is not elected by us. So there's your first question mark. But I think for me, that is where democracy, where it's rooted, is in the people being first, not the leaders. And that's where I think things go wrong again and again and again, because all too often we find the leaders that in some cases we have elected, in other cases are just stepped into power themselves. They don't serve us. And without that, for me, there is no democracy. It's the say of the people, right? And if we're not having a say, then
It's not democracy.
not a democracy.
And I'm glad you brought it back to the United Kingdom, because you, as a first generation British immigrant, me as a second generation American immigrant, I think a lot of people who have had their families within the country for a long time they have generational history within that country. They look at their government and they see an uncorruptible entity that will just very strong, very, very truth, very out in the open, um, can't falter, always going to be rich, and it's not true.
Mm,
It's not true. It's a very biased way of thinking. It's a very egotistical way of thinking. Governments, no matter what, have the potential to go sour, to become corrupt, to lose, to not prioritize their citizenry in front of their leaders. And it's up to the populace to always be questioning that, to always be keeping their leaders accountable, as you said. And it's difficult. I think, you're bringing in an interesting perspective, saying, there was corruption scandals during COVID-19. There's a questionable person in the royal family. You can't vote out a royal family. The
nope.
prime minister, in the prime minister, wasn't elected. There are things here that you kind of just see them for what it is. And I think for you, it's much more simple because you've had that international view. You've had that more global perspective. But for people who have been immersed within that culture, British people who have been immersed within the UK and haven't traveled too much outside of their country, or even
Mm,
haven't even if they haven't, just because you can travel and keep yourself sheltered, as we mentioned people who travel to Africa but still have a superiority complex.
mm.
you I'm not sure, but you have to take that, take the emotion out of it, which isn't easy, and see things for what they are, and question things, even things that make, that's a little bit uncomfortable, because systems can falter.
Yeah, they can. And right now, if you look in the UK, our National Health Service, which is such a gift to this country, is crumbling under the strain of a government who themselves are off getting richer, making tons of money, and they want to put in, and they pretty much have put in a policy where anyone seeking asylum in this country, if they're not granted it or try and cross to this country, are going to get deported to Rwanda against their wishes. And you see all this and you think, yet there are people in this country who'll say, oh, Africans and Asians, those guys are all corrupt. And you read about these scandals and you think, this is just a different brand of corruption, guys. Your leaders are not any better than the corrupt ones in other parts of the world. But this little superiority thing some of you guys have going just because we're British, it's not getting you anywhere. And that's actually quite a frustrating thing to deal with on a regular basis, because I think people sometimes intentionally choose to have a blind eye to what's going on. And I also think in other cases, people are too exhausted trying to survive out these systems. Right now, because of the cost of heating electricity, we see news stories of young parents and elderly people who are parents of young children and elderly people who can't afford to have the heating on in their homes, and it's cold here. Those guys are just at this point fighting for every day, just getting through the day. They don't have probably the strength to even come out and protest against the government or whatever it is. So I think it's a two-side thing. I think there is those that are being battered by the system here are too busy trying to survive out the battering of this by the system, and then there's those who just are like, oh, but we're patriotic, British patriotic. We're not like those guys.
And it goes back to what you mentioned about having the privilege to work for free,
Mm-hmm.
having the privilege to put these sort of words in a different perspective out there, one with less of a Western superiority complex. And because there are people who are the real, victims. I mean, victims generally don't have the space to go out and fight.
No, a lot of the time they don't. And at this point, I think, so there's because of the situation with the National Health Service, we've been told the ambulance wait is hours on end at the moment if you need an ambulance. And the government response has been to say, so be careful over this weekend. And none of us, no one really in this country is immune from that. If something happens and I need an ambulance, I'm not going to have one for a few hours. So I think it's those kind of things where it's like there are certain things which are affecting people who are very vulnerable, and then there are certain things which are affecting pretty much all of us. Because if the Prime Minister falls over, he's probably got enough to get himself to a hospital. He's got enough of an entourage to do it for him. If any of us fall over and we're waiting how many hours for an ambulance? And that absolute detachment from the reality of most people in this country is why I will always say and maintain that every country has its challenges with its government, but we cannot sit here and say this one is better than that one, because we enjoy certain freedoms here that in certain countries in other parts of the world the populace may not enjoy in terms of certain freedoms of speech, but we also have our own, the West and Western governments are not some kind of messiah who are there to, being all, this is the way you should be. They have their own problems and they create their own problems for the rest of us.
And one of those that we mentioned, I think it was before we started recording, was you had moved to Nairobi earlier this year, and you also grew up in London. So in London, there's no need for a car, but Nairobi has modeled its city around, Western. I'm guessing United Cities in America, where cities in America were all designed with the intention that every person has a car. Every person is going to use a vehicle, park it at their home, drive it to work, and drive it to everywhere that they want to go. And it seems like you mentioned that sort of urban planning reached Nairobi, but it's not beneficial to the populace there.
So Nairobi is a wonderful city, and it's a nice place. No complaints from me on many things, but I think what I've noticed, and there's a Kenyan writer called Patrick Gathara, and he'd flagged this in one of his pieces where he said the majority of the population of Nairobi get around on foot, yet it is not a pedestrian-friendly city. And that is something I've seen again and again this last few months when I've been there. There are not really many pedestrian walkways. People trying to cross. So I just wrote my column for Debunk Media this week was about that. People trying to cross Waiyaki Way. You're running across hoping for the best, and so I think Nairobi. Waiyaki Way is one of their roads, one of their very busy roads, and it's near where I stay. And so, you'll be in the Uber or in the car and you'll see people just running across, and you think, well, considering the amount that population of the city that either are on foot or using public transport, it would be useful to make this city more friendly for them. And I am very, very clear that I'm not comparing Nairobi to London. I don't sit there and say, oh, but in London it's like this. No, it's not about that at all. I'm not wired in the way where I'd constantly be comparing that city to this city. My mind just does not function that way. It's more being like, but does Nairobi work for the majority of the people who live there? And I think that's something that I just observed. For me, being used to living in a city like London, where I can get around on foot everywhere and I can use the underground, whereas when I'm in Nairobi, I generally do need to be driven, be it cab, be it with anyone I'm with. That, you know, that is what it is. And it's taken some getting used to, for sure. I think it was just something where I felt like, oh, there's so much of this city where people, it could probably do with better public transport and better roads, yet. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. And I think the thing I said in the piece was, you've got wonderful shopping malls in Nairobi, you've got wonderful hotels, lit up buildings, and it's nice. And it's all well and good wanting to make the city look like that. But what about making it work for people who live there? Drainage, no flooding when it rains, green spaces for people to walk in. They've culled so many trees over the last couple of years. What about all of that? That's equally as important as having big malls and hotels for your tourists or your wealthier residents.
And it goes back to prioritizing the populace.
Yeah.
It's, the government has to prioritize the populace in its work.
Absolutely.
Which a lot of governments, be it Western, non-Western, that perspective can be lost for the perspective of the few.
Yeah.
So one thing you mentioned and one thing that you post about is African literature. What did you read before you visited Africa, and what literature, what distinguishes African literature to you?
So I think initially we were always encouraged to read as kids. My mum used to be an English teacher, so it was always encouraged. And then when you get into teenagehood and you're reading books from the States, right? So Sweet Valley High, and pretty much all the characters are white, and you're no longer seeing yourself in those books. And so I began to read books by writers from around the world, because even at that time, you weren't getting loads of Black British or British Asian writers out in the library or in the bookshops. It was still a small number. So I started reading books by Indian authors from India. And as I got older, I got into my 20s, it was more world literature, and Africa just fell into that, right? So I would read books by writers from Asia, from South America, from Africa. And then when I've fallen into the career path I have, I found myself, again, still reading books from around the world. And that meant writers from the African continent and the African diaspora. And I started doing this list every year, an article, best African books of the year. And it was just because I knew my audience are generally from the continent, and why not tell them, well, these are the best books I've read this year. And also I wanted to kind of highlight, especially when I first started it, I want to highlight all these amazing African writers and poets, and be like, these guys are amazing, because some of them had mainstream success, some of them have mainstream success, others weren't so in the mainstream, in the spotlight. But I think that's changed a lot now, because you are getting a lot of writers of color, African writers, Asian writers, whatever, the attention on them. You get a lot more small publishers who focus on publishing these writers. But African literature is the same as every other literature. There's nothing that makes it African. It's just, these are writers from the continent, or who hail from the continent, and they write stories just like everyone else. And I remember one of the first books I mentioned in my list was called From Pasta to Pigfoot, and it was by a British Ghanaian writer called Francis Mensah. And the reason I spoke about that book so much was because it's like a romantic comedy, you know, and for so long, and writers say this themselves, that when you're a writer of color, there is an expectation that you're going to write about race and colonialism and really heavy subjects. And this book came along, and it was about a girl who grew up here, who goes to Ghana for a holiday and falls in love with a boy, and it's all romantic and it gets butterflies in your tummy. And I was like, this, you know, the fact is you've got African writers who write books like this, and they're just as good as everything else that's out there. And so for me, when I read a book, it never feels like, oh, I'm reading this by an African writer. It just feels like I'm reading this by a writer. And I love that there is such vast subjects that are covered from, you know, you do find a lot more light romance now, set in African countries. And then, yeah, you get the more serious stuff. But it is, every time, you know, an African writer that I really admire comes out with a new book, I'm always really looking forward to it.
Okay. It's the same.
It's an authentic voice as well. It's an authentic voice as well, isn't it? It's when you read something by a writer like, God, there's so many names in my head right now. I don't know which one to pick. But, you know, you read books by writers living in those countries, and a lot of those books aren't written for Western audience. They're just written, and it's a different perspective. It's a different narrative.
It's a different perspective, but the values are similar. Love, despair, I'm guessing family.
Oh God, yeah, family, love, despair, politics, everything you will find white writers cover, they cover. That's it, you know. It's just different. I think we're seeing a rise in more kind of mysticism. So you have a few books coming out which have that kind of genre, and part of that kind of genre, and it's amazing. It's so cool, and I just appreciate that African writers are writing about whatever they want to write about, and we're all reading it.
Yes, it's good for humanity that we have we're taking in dialogue from more sources and not just the top Western sources.
Yeah.
Samira, we've spoken about your background, about writing, about Africa. Are there any last words or thoughts you'd like to leave the audience?
Oh gosh, it's that time of year, isn't it?
Yes.
I think, you know, whenever I have conversations like this, I'm always aware of how much more there is for me to do in my line of work, and how much more my colleagues in the industry have to do. And I think that the thing I will leave people with really is to encourage them to really look beyond your mainstream sources when you're consuming news, when you're consuming stories. We live in an age now where you've got all these foreign films on Netflix, foreign TV shows, and I mean foreign if you're Brit or wherever you are, really. You know, I always encourage people to watch, read. The internet has opened up a huge world to us, because there are other narratives out there, and the Western media one is not always the right one. And for anyone who is thinking of sending that email or sending that text, the way I sat here wanting to send that email to, you know, the Observer newspaper in the Uganda, please do it. because it really, honestly, you don't want to be sitting there in 5 years' time thinking, what if I'd sent that email or that text, you know, in whatever context, be it work, be it love, be it whatever, just send the message.
My guest today has been Samira Sawlani. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Samira.
Thank you.